and healing lives through the love of our Lord Jesus Christ. It looks like I need to speak closer to the microphone. Maybe I'll just hold it. I welcome you to Voices for Justice. This is not a series event where we're preaching, not preaching to anybody. We're not suggesting how you should vote. Our aim and goal is to help inform about Project 2025 and how, if implemented, it affects justice. As a church made up of followers of Jesus Christ, we are called to actions of faith. And central to the gospel is justice, to love God and to love our neighbors. This is a call for all faiths, right? Whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Quaker or Buddhist or whatever your faith is, we're all united in the call to justice. As an act of justice, we offer this panel this morning, and we will learn from each one of them, I am certain. In this time of great division, with the November election just around the corner, the question arises for many of us: how might we contribute? What can one person or one group of people really do? From that question, Voices of Justice was birthed. This is our third presentation. In the end of September, we had a presentation on the border. Last Saturday, we had this wonderful event called Songs in the Key of Resistance, and we learned and sang songs for marches. And the people that led are from the Cairo Center, and they have been in many places in our country and in the world where marches, that nonviolent protest was initiated and wonderfully presented. On January 26 and 2025, I just want to tell you, we're offering a presentation on LGBTQ+ and the celebration of diversity. HRP Queer will be leading us in that event. And on February 8th, we have Braver Angels coming. I don't know if you know Braver Angels. It's an organization that brings people with opposing views, Republican, Democrat, whatever, and offers workshops on how we can connect with one another apart from our divisions. So that'll be in February. So we're looking forward to that. When we become a voice for the voiceless, or take a stand for justice, or speak truth to power, it is not surprising that there might be opposition or resistance. That has been true again this time. We did receive a harassing phone call about today. The police came and checked things out. The leadership of the church met, and how do we respond? We respond with endurance, commitments, and determination. We are not deterred. We stand for justice. That is our response today. A number of years ago, the church also faced an issue when Nazi propaganda was presented around the community, and the leadership responded then as they do today. Our faith in Jesus compels us to respond in boldness and love for all people. As Cornel West said, and I love this quote, you brought this up last Saturday and I really like it: justice is what love looks like in public. Wonderful quote. And as Edgar put it in our responding emails, if we're not making world enemies, then we're doing something wrong. The world hated Jesus first. So here we gather. Our program for today: how many of you know something about Project 2025? Okay. We believe that if implemented, it will be a threat to our democracy. Our Constitution begins with the preamble, "We, the people." And words from Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address: a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Ideals worth dying for, he said, that so many have offered their lives, and it is up to the living to carry on the work of those who had died to protect them. A republic if we can keep it. A quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin, meaning that the responsibility to maintain a republic lies with the citizens of the country, who must actively participate and protect their democratic system to ensure that it endures. This statement was made actually in 1787 when someone asked what kind of government they had created. It is on those principles that we gather today. What we present this morning is only a small piece of Project 2025, and I'm just going to give you a few sentences about what it is. It is a conservative movement's detailed and specific plan for what the next Republican president should do with his power, including its preparation to put that plan into practice. Organized by the right-wing tank called the Heritage Foundation and advised by more than 100 conservative groups, Project 2025 has put forth, as you probably know, a 922-page list of policy recommendations. It's not a pie-in-the-sky policy. It is crafted to be a list of things that the next president appointees really can do. So that's some of the details about. I wanted to call your attention to this if you're interested. It's called The People's Guide to Project 2025, and it's available online if you want to learn more. Now about this morning, we are live streaming the panel discussion so that it can be available online. Thanks to Jared and Jen, who's going to make that possible. But we're not going to live stream our conversation afterwards. We feel like people might feel a little bit less afraid to speak out. And we're hoping we'll have a good conversation afterwards. Our panelists, I'm going from that end of the table. Women's rights, Catherine Page. Immigration. Yeah, I'm right? Yeah. Suddenly I thought, wait a minute. Robin Larkins is going to talk to us about immigration. Racial justice is Edgar Hayes. Economics is Kelly Smith. And climate is Fred Milligan. And I'll tell you that I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then I only have 2 questions for them. And I just want to remind you that at this table in the front, there's some information and brochures if you want to take a look at them at the end of our time together. So I think we're ready to start. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, and here's the first question. What motivated you to be interested in the topic you're presenting today, and why is that topic important? And then when you're done, just pass the microphone, so we'll just follow one another with that question. Thanks.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Pater, and I am a Presbyterian pastor and also a PhD student in practical theology at the Claremont School of Theology, focusing on reproductive justice and on religious education and the relationship between those things. Why is this topic important? So as a Presbyterian, and in our tradition, we are sitting in a Presbyterian church now, so I feel that's a really wonderful place to speak from. We have a very strong, in our tradition, sense of and theology of religious liberty. By that I mean that we are allowed to have a large range of opinions on certain issues, but one of the things that we have always been theologically consistent on is that when it comes to certain issues, people, regardless of their religious tradition in America, have an absolute right to live out that religious liberty as long as it doesn't interfere with the rights of others. And so my interest in the topic of women's rights and reproductive justice comes from that Presbyterian tradition and that very felt faith-based sense that when it comes to some issues that are so deeply personal, that are so deeply theological, that it should be a matter of people making their own individual religious, spiritual, and medical decisions, and should not necessarily be the realm of the government to make decisions. Which isn't to say that we don't have theological opinions about when life begins or how to treat women in certain situations. I feel very grateful I can sit here in a collar today as a woman and as a queer woman, and in my tradition that's considered fine. But a lot of what I'll speak about today is the way that Project 2025 interferes with the religious liberty of women, pregnant people, and families. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Catherine. My name is Robin Larkins, and I have an MBA from St. Joe's University in Philadelphia. I was born and raised a Catholic, and I was educated in the spirit and spiritually formed in the tradition of Mother Cabrini, because I worked for the Cabrini Sisters, the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart, for over 20 years, and their primary areas of missionary and apostolic focus was women, children, and immigrants. So I left the corporate world in 1999 and I went to work for the Cabrini sisters, and I was a witness to the second tower being attacked on 9/11 and its aftermath. And at that point, I became involved with Cabrini Immigrant Services in New York City, and then later came to be the director of Cabrini Immigrant Services in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and Westchester County, a place where when I told people what I was doing, they said, "Oh, there's immigrants in Dobbs Ferry." So the everyday experience of immigrant families, and particularly children, became a passion of mine. So in 7 years as the director of Cabrini Immigrant Services, that's when I encountered the first and probably only welcoming organization in Dobbs Ferry that allowed us to do some of the programming that we did was South Presbyterian Church. And so that invitation became another passion of mine and connection of mine, and I currently serve as the administrator of South Presbyterian Church, and I'm very grateful to the Reverend Joe Gilmore, who first invited me as a new director of a not-for-profit, having never had the experience of working in direct service ministry before, and then went from there. So during my time at Cabrini Immigrant Services, the Violence Against Women Act and the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, were very prevalent. And during that time, I became very involved with running clinics throughout the area, and worked with unaccompanied minors and trained volunteers in doing accompaniment ministry. So as a result of that, I founded a not-for-profit that helps level the playing field for children, particularly in immigrant families. And I currently do that work simultaneous to the work that I do with South Church. So the reason why this is important is there was a quote from Mother Cabrini, who's the patron saint of immigrants, that said, "Remember where you came from." And I think that's a guiding force that I know I hold very dear, even personally. I am the granddaughter of an Italian immigrant who would have been considered an unaccompanied minor today. And I am from a family of very conservative people that I continually have to remind that of. And that, again, we all have our family stories. And in my work in immigration, realizing that the last major immigration reform occurred over 2 generations ago is extremely concerning to me, and should be to everyone, because of the tradition and the foundation in which we were founded as a country. And then that will lead into the conversation about Project 2025. So thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate being here.
Well, good morning. I am Edgar Hayes. I am a commission ruling elder in the Hudson River Presbytery. I don't have I'm not assigned to a church. I'm doing pulpit supply, so I've preached here and on screen in 2020, and I love visiting other churches and worshiping with other people. And I think worship is our connecting point. God is our connecting point. And so the discussion of race as it connects with Project 2025, I'm very, very impacted and interested in discussing and learning about it and talking about it and sharing and growing together to understand how can the church, because that's what's most important to me, how can the church, how can Christians, how can followers of Christ or folks who call themselves Christians move together to a place where it is God-centered, not world-centered, not people-centered, but God-centered, and how everyone can be uplifted. See, if Project 2025 uplifted the rights and dignity, humanity, and humility of everyone, we probably wouldn't have this conversation. We probably wouldn't be here, but it doesn't. It sort of represses and suppresses people of color and LGBTQ and immigrants, and it's so confounding. 900 plus pages of a mess. So that's why I'm interested in this from a Christian perspective and talking about it from the perspective of the church versus a secular us versus them, Republican versus Democrat. You know, that's not why I'm here. Like I said, CRE, I am the co-moderator of the Committee on Representation in the Hudson River Presbyterian and the co-moderator of the Racial Justice Team. So this is, very dear to me, this discussion on race and Project 2025. Is a lot to decipher from. So I picked stuff from folks who have looked through it, and hopefully these cliff notes will help me to share information with you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kelly Smith. I live in New York City, and I'm actually not part of the Presbyterian, but I'm a deacon at Middle Collegiate Church that has had a long time focus on justice and has been initially, I think, where my faith justice work really got sort of caught on fire. I was in the corporate world for years. Well, first let me say, I grew up as an evangelical Christian in a conservative church in the Midwest. I grew up in Indiana. I grew up with one side of my family actually talking about the Heritage Foundation in this very, very positive way, and that you look to them to help make decisions. I say that to say this has been going on for decades and decades. This 900-page disaster did not just sort of come out of thin air. This has been, they have been working and placing judges and doing all sorts of things for decades. I'm with the Poor People's Campaign. I'm a volunteer. It's a completely volunteer organization. Back in 2018, I was in the corporate world for a long time, and I was doing diversity and inclusion, thinking I was doing kind of decent work. But I was in a large financial Wall Street law firm that was predominantly white straight males. So doing diversity inclusion was a little like beating your head against the wall for 21 years. In 2018, I kind of felt a call. I'd heard Dr. Barber speak a couple of times. I heard rumblings about the Poor People's Campaign being relaunched. The Poor People's Campaign, just so you know, was first launched by Reverend Dr. King in 1968. And I heard a call, and I quit my job and thought, I'll volunteer for 5 to 6 months. I'll work on the election. That was when we were trying to flip the House. And I'll volunteer with the Poor People's Campaign and then go back to some sort of regular life. I've now been doing this 7 years, again, predominantly as a volunteer, piecing together a little contract work here and there. And I also I helped launch the New York State Poor People's Campaign, which I'm going to talk just a little bit more about when we circle back around. And I'm also helping to launch the New York chapter of the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, which is another movement that is patterned after Dr. King's movement of the poor, nonviolent army of the poor. Very briefly, this topic totally speaks to me. You can't look at economics without talking about poverty. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. Even though you do not hear either candidate ever use the word poor. Poor is like a dirty word in our country, and we know it's not, because we know people are made poor by systems that create poverty and then sustain poverty. So I was interested in this because so much of this economics actually relates to keeping the wealthy wealthy and the poor poor, and even in many instances more poor. And 43% of us are poor. 43% of Americans are poor or one $400 emergency away. One blown tire on your car, one laptop breaking, one furnace breaking away from food instability and housing instability. So when we use that term poor, I'm not ashamed to say it, I'm poor. 43% of us are poor. And poverty is the fourth leading cause of death in this country. So as we dive into Project 2025, we'll see that there is a real blaming of the poor in so much of it. A real vilifying, criminalizing, all sorts of things of the poor. And I think it's really important as people of faith. I mean, Jesus Christ spent way more time talking about taking care of people and really organizing the poor. So we can get into that theological discussion, but he was a revolutionary. And so it's something that is in our core as people of faith to do, and to not do out of charity, but to do because we all deserve to thrive, not just survive, but to thrive. So thank you, and look forward to talking more about this.
Hello, I'm Fred Milligan, and I am a ordained Presbyterian minister, recently retired, and now I'm pouring myself heart, soul, and spirit into work around issues of climate change. My interest in the environment and concern for it grew as a child, as I grew as a child and as a young Christian, and found myself in a specific situation, just as I turned 16 and had my first driver's license in a small town in rural Arkansas, where I grew up, where my father and mother owned a gas station. And I was working in the gas station, and the mayor of the small town came to me one day and he said, Freddie, I'm known as Freddie because my father's Fred Sr. Freddie, would you be interested in being our first garbage collector in our town? Would you take your family pickup truck around and pick up people's garbage? And I said, okay, sure. Easy money, I thought. My dad would let me use the pickup truck and go around and pick up the garbage. So they sent out the notice, and on the day I went out and I picked up the few bags of garbage people had put on the street in front of their homes. Well, to the extent we even had streets in that little town. And it was only then I realized I hadn't really thought to ask anyone what I was supposed to do with this garbage. And then there was a very shameful situation developed where I had found an old country road someplace and dumped it off on the side of the road, and then I was required to go pick it up, of course, and convinced my father to let me put the garbage in an eroded part of the land on our family farm there out in the country. And but they only had a couple of rounds of this garbage pickup before the leaders in the community decided they didn't need garbage collection. They would just keep burning it in their backyard as they had. It was that situation that sort of brought home to me the relationship between our consumer lifestyle and our relationship to the natural world. And over the years, as I did my preparation for ministry and then graduate studies in social ethics, I became more and more focused on matters of justice in general, gender justice, racial justice, poverty issues, and so forth, but continued to come back to this matter of our relationship to the natural world as stewards, as the stewards God called us to be, to care for this planet. I was able to participate in a volunteer for mission project that took me and a few other young adults to Italy for a conference that was sponsored by the World Council of Churches with young people from around Europe on sustainable economic development, where we did engage more deeply into how our planet that we live on needs to be sustained for us to live here as we continue to develop our economies, and how we might do that in a more equitable manner. Then in 2001, I had the opportunity to represent the Presbyterians for Earth Care organization that I had been serving on their steering committee for about 9 years during the time while I was an associate for stewardship education for the General Assembly. And I had the opportunity to represent the Presbyterians for Earth Care organization at the Global Conference of Partners, it's called, COP26, that was held in Glasgow, Scotland. And there I was able to experience firsthand the level of anxiety being felt amongst the leaders of the world and amongst the scientists of the world through the International Panel on Climate Change, the consensus that the scientists have around the issue of the urgency of climate change. So that kind of brought together my own personal history with where this issue stands and what's important about this issue for me, and why I feel it's important for me to engage with this, because all of the issues, all the social justice issues that I care about, and so many of us in this room care about, really operate on a table, as it were, of the environment. You know, this global environment, our atmosphere that exists and makes it possible for us to live, for us to possibly thrive if we have more justice, and, you know, possibly not thrive if we have less justice. But all the progress that we make around justice is dependent upon this table that we all live upon, this globe, this environment. And scientists have been telling us now for years that the amount of carbon, the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere has never been so great as it is today in the whole history of humanity. That if we don't reduce the amount of greenhouse gases by 2030, we will change life on the planet in ways that will involve the eradication of many species of life, and the possibility for our own life as human beings. So for me, this is why I believe my focus on climate change and the issue of climate change is not just one among many justice issues, although it affects the poor more than it affects the rich, because the rich are able to continue moving, continue finding ways to escape the consequences of climate change more readily than the poor. It's going to affect everyone. It's going to affect everyone. It's already affecting everyone. I heard just this morning an analysis of the most recent two hurricanes, Helene and Milton, that climate change has increased the cost of these weather events by 40%. Just the economic costs, not to mention the devastation to lives, the economic costs have been increased by 40% just due to climate change. So for me, this is what brings me to the topic of climate change and why I think we must, in any way possible, avoid having Project 2025 come into force because, and I'll talk more about that later.
Thank you to all of you, and I know how passionate you all are, and we could have had a one, each of you one at a time, because there's so much to say about it. So as I ask you the second question, I want to ask you to sort of shorten your presentations just a bit, and then as people ask questions, then we can go into maybe a little bit more depth, okay? So the second question that I'm asking is, what are your concerns for your impassioned topic and the effects of Project 2025? And if you don't mind passing the microphone down, we'll just start again with, yeah, just pass it down. And then we sort of hear different voices. If you don't mind, Catherine, we'll start with you. Thanks.
So there are many ways in which women's rights and reproductive freedom will be affected by what is implemented if Project 2025 is implemented. But bottom line is, from a faith-based perspective, it will affect, as Jesus said when he came, right? He came to give us life and give it abundantly, right? And these laws, if they are implemented, these policies, if implemented, will bottom line affect the ability of women, pregnant people, and their families to live, and to live abundantly. And that is partially because all these other issues they're all intersectional, they're all related to each other, right? And women's rights will be affected because immigrant women will suffer more. People of color will suffer more. People of less economic means who are affected by these issues suffer more. But there are some particular things that will affect women in general that I want to highlight on Project 2025, if I can get my phone to open, as the millennial who's doing this on her phone. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that I'm not a doctor and not a lawyer, so I speak about this as an expert in the theological side of things, right, and not necessarily the legal side. But the first thing it will do is try to reverse the FDA's approval of mifepristone, which is one of the drugs used in medication abortion. In the United States, 2/3 of abortions happen early enough in pregnancy that they happen through medication abortion. And again, in my religious tradition, it is permissible, depending on your own perspective, and maybe even encouraged in some moral circumstances to seek a medical procedure like that, especially if the life of a woman or the life of a family is being physically or emotionally or psychologically or economically threatened by a particular pregnancy, right? So that would end, it would essentially be a shadow ban because it would end 2/3 of abortion access overnight. So that's one major concern that Project 2025 is creating for women and for their families. The second is that it seeks to revive a 19th century law called the Comstock Act, which you might have heard about, kind of. Again, not the legal expert in the room, but there is an 1873. So think about how long ago that was. That was before women had the legal right to vote, right? 1873. That was an anti-vice and anti-obscene matter law that they would evoke to keep people, whether they be activists, physicians, churches, doesn't matter, from sending any abortion or contraceptive related materials in the mail because they would be considered obscene material. Keep in mind that in the 1870s, these prohibitions against abortion, against contraception, at that time, there was a concern about promiscuity and obscenity. It was actually not a concern about life. It was not actually a theological debate so much as it was a social debate, that if women had access to these things, there would be basically more sexual activity that was outside the control of marriage, and that is what people were concerned about. So this would stop organizations like Planned Parenthood or Plan C from mailing medication abortion, especially to women in states that is their only source of an abortion at this point because of laws in those states. It would also potentially ban even religious organizations for whom it is, a matter of a religious liberty to talk about these issues, to disseminate scientifically accurate and socially accurate and legally accurate information about abortion and contraception, right? So that is another thing that would be interfered with in terms of religious liberty and women's rights in this law. Another thing is that it would call for the Department of Health and Human Services to not enforce EMTALA. So if you haven't heard of that, it's the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. There's a Supreme Court case about this recently. If you want to learn more about that, I can give you resources. But it basically requires hospitals that are providing any kind of emergency care that if a woman comes in and is having a miscarriage, to provide treatment for that miscarriage, right? And it would keep that from being enforced as long as that baby were still alive, according to its own definitions of alive, even if there was no hope for that pregnancy, but there was hope for saving that woman's life. Lest you think that this is an abstract issue, in states where there are already abortion bans, this is already becoming an issue. EMTALA is having a hard time being enforced. In fact, in Idaho, they have taken to airlifting women to Utah and to other states who are having active miscarriages because doctors are afraid of treating miscarriages because they're afraid of the implications of this law being enforced along with an abortion ban. Like those things can't be reconciled by the hospital's lawyers and doctors. So they're just airlifting women who are bleeding out to other states. So we would see a national crisis around women who are having a crisis in pregnancy, a medical crisis. The more Orwellian point, number 4, that I think everyone should know about, is the plan proposes changing the Department of Health and Human Services into, I kid you not, the Department of Life. They would change the name of the department, and they would implement in that department a cross-department anti-abortion task force to make sure that every other department in the federal government is working to make sure abortion bans are being enforced, anti-contraception bans are being enforced, that sexual education is not being taught except for abstinence only. And so there would be a department organized around surveilling pregnancy, around surveilling obedience of certain laws regarding pregnancy and women's rights, and it would all be wrapped up in one department whose job it would be to monitor those things. There are lots of other things in there that kind of go across the plan, and so I'll just kind of loop them all in together. But it would also include various efforts to reduce access to contraception, lest you think that that's, pie in the sky and not happening. There are several states that are already trying to ban things like IUDs and like emergency contraception because it essentially is to some people being interpreted as essentially a way of having an abortion, which is actually not scientifically accurate. It would ban comprehensive sex education, which of course doesn't just affect women, but affects children, affects families, affects everyone, would spread false information about abortion safety. An important piece of information to know is that abortion in the United States is safer than pregnancy in the United States. That is even more true if you are a woman of color or a woman of lower socioeconomic means. So part of what they would do as part of this department and part of their effort is actually spread misinformation about how safe abortion is, about how safe contraception is, and about methods that should be available to help people make their own decisions about their bodies, often from very deeply held religious beliefs, right? And last but not least, it would actually try to implement and use different departments within the federal government to export these ideas internationally. If you are not familiar with the global gag rule, it basically is an administrative rule that gets usually implemented when certain Republican administrations come into power and then taken out basically day one when Democratic administrations come into power. But it basically says the federal government can't give any money to organizations around the world that provide any kind of abortion care whatsoever. So that means that if we wanted to send money to a clinic in, say, Nairobi, Kenya, and that clinic, most of the work they were doing was HIV and AIDS work and prevention and contraception and family planning and all these other things, but they also provided abortions, we would not be able to provide funds to that health clinic under the global gag rule. So it would expand, it would reinstate that global gag rule, obviously, and then it would expand the number of places that we could not send money to based on the kind of work that they do. So this would have a terrible effect on women, a terrible effect on families, and a terrible effect globally if Project 2025 were implemented.
Wow.
Sorry. Not my idea.
Sorry, but not much good news on this next topic either. The threat of Project 2025 is already happening, and in terms of immigration, one of the things that the Hudson River Presbytery enacted last year through their grant program was establishing what we call an asylum seeker partnership, which I am a co-chair with along with Catherine, and we worked with asylum seekers that are technically, legally seeking asylum in this country, being moved around from state to state, and when they arrived in New York, were being transported to various places, including the Hudson Valley, and we got involved with several of the motels that were housing them. And as we were updating what was going to happen over this next year after we piloted this program, we realized that we don't have any degree of certainty of what's going to happen in addition to New York changing the program of the residents that were residing in motels, was the election and what was going to happen in the election. Because basically, immigration has been the platform of which that one of the candidates in the election has been running on, and the amount of disinformation that's being spread about immigration currently has been unbelievable. And the premises of Project 2025 pretty much would affect every single way someone could enter into the U.S. So when I said before that it's been over 2 generations since there's been legislative immigration reform, we're talking about a pathway that would change even some of the protections that are already in place, including asylum. So basically, any legal pathway, any process by which someone has temporary protected status, for example, including our Haitian brothers and sisters, would be in jeopardy. The State Department would be directed to, quote, eliminate or significantly reduce the number of visas issued to persons seeking asylum and to foreign students from, quote, enemy nations. So that's another way in which immigrants legally enter into this country is through student visas and other things. Temporary protected status. Project 2025 issues a blanket call for protections to be stripped, and that is continuing something that was begun in the first term of a Trump administration. Family-based immigration, which is called, quote, chain migration, would be reduced or eliminated. So that would mean that if someone was born in this country, even that protection would be very much in question as a result of the Project 2025 initiatives. So the low-skilled seasonal worker visas, again, would be, quote, winded down. Those programs, H-2A, H-2B, low-skilled seasonal work visas would be aimed at eliminating both of those. Fewer immigrants would be legally allowed to work. So this mandate for leadership that Project 2025 purports would probably not only decimate ways in which people could enter this country and become legal, quote, the right way, it would also have very extreme impacts on what has existed currently in this country. For example, federal housing. If one person in a household is not a documented immigrant, there would be no subsidies for federal housing. In states where there are loan programs available for immigrant students, those would be federally eliminated. And then the enforcement of these things would become very much a militaristic effort of expulsion that has frightening prospects in terms of how that would be impacted. So the quote, specter of deportation would be something that would be hanging over every single person who would try to enter this country, and for those already living here. Most of the relief efforts that have come to date would grandfather in people who have been here for a number of years. And what would happen now is that the ability for houses to be raided, for places of work and schools and even churches, for the enforcement of these policies would be wide open territory. So the enforcement, the platforms upon which some of these measures would be taken would be very, very, very extreme. And it's not just based on fact, it's based on the rhetoric that is going on every single day. You do not have to look very far each day. And last night I was talking to Edgar before I printed out this graphic from the Fox News headline, Trump talks immigration and crime in Aurora, California, with the signs posted, deport illegals now, end migrant crimes. And in the course of literally between last night at 8 o'clock when I printed this and this morning, some of the headlines that came out of the rhetoric that is being advanced. These people are so evil. They are not your run-of-the-mill criminal. They are people that are satanic. This is speaking of Venezuelan migrants to this country that are seeking asylum legally. They are involved in human sacrifice. They are raping men, women, and children, especially underage children. The quote from last night. From yesterday, look at Springfield. And P.S., I'm from a town named Springfield, Pennsylvania. So kind of this sense of this is every town, and these are the messages that are being purported, where 30,000 illegal immigrants are dropped. And they may have done it through a certain little trick, but they are illegal immigrants as far as I'm concerned. They're destroying the town, they're destroying the whole, they'll end up destroying the state. We cannot let this happen. So folks, it's not just illegal immigrants that we're talking about, it's immigrants, period. And it doesn't matter if they're legal or not, they could be targets under Project 2025. So if we go back to that premise of, and this weekend in particular, as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, very few of us are really from here. So if we look at that as our guide, then who is really safe under what's going to happen if Project 2025 becomes a reality?
Yeah, I want to reiterate the point that we have to look at this from a lens of Christians or people of faith, not necessarily Christians, but it's people of faith. Because the manifestation of this Project 2025 is under the guise of Christianity, believe it or not. I wanted to point out some things. There's so much. It really is unbelievably so much. I'm going to read from the Philadelphia Tribune. They wrote a series on Project 2025, and I'll pick out some things that they reported. The authors want the president to work with Congress to amend the Affordable Care Act, so insurance providers no longer would have to cover the week after pill or any other contraceptives on religious or moral grounds. And this is the insurance providers. They want the Department of Health and Human Services should withhold funding from states with schools that require training in abortion procedures. And everyone knows they want to defund Planned Parenthood. And a lot of poor communities depend on Planned Parenthood, not only for abortions, but also for the how to have this reproductive health and all the resources that you get, because our healthcare system is tied to our jobs. So the better the job, the better the healthcare you have. The lesser job you have, the less healthcare you have, the less resources you have. So eliminating that would hurt a lot of communities of color. Oh, they want to eliminate the student loan forgiveness, which would increase wealth of Black Americans by 40%. Project 2025 calls for the abolition of the Department of Education. Since school funding in Pennsylvania relies heavily on local real estate taxes, school districts in poor areas already receive less funding. So it's a constant attack on poor communities that already are suffering. So how much more suffering under your Christian ideals do you want to get? It is so antithetical to Christ. I don't see how they can say with a straight face that I am Christian and I am building this from the foundation of Christ. My thing is they don't know the real Christ, but the Christ they created, which is an idol Christianity. Another thing, why would you think of cutting Head Start? So I grew up in Harlem, family on welfare, poor. I can tell you how many buildings were condemned, just boarded up, and in the 70s, and just poor. Head Start for us was major. It provided a meal for us when we breakfast and lunch. I still remember some days and singing some songs at Head Start. I thought Head Start was wonderful, and it is a wonderful program. Like, where in your heart, where Christ should live, that says we should take this away from communities who readily need it? Project 2025 calls for the immediate elimination of the Census Bureau National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. So it's the counting and trying to get folks counted for the census. So without that, you do not have a proper understanding of the population. So the amount of your population is in direct correlation to the resources that come from Washington and your representation and how many resources can come to your community. So without the proper numbers, you get less resources. Less resources means you don't get the help you need in your communities. You don't get the help you need in your community. It's just a spiral downward. We have to figure out ways how we as people of faith can spiral upwards towards Christ and building up communities, poor communities. And like you said, they don't say poor, but that's where people of faith comes in to say, you need to talk about these communities. You need to say, we want to build everyone up. Middle class up, poor up, everyone up. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I'm getting upset as I think about it, but it's just so sad that they use the guise of Christianity to do these things, and that's what's upsetting me.
Thank you so much, Edgar. And you hit some of my points, so that'll save a little time too. Yeah, so, I mean, one of the reasons I joined the Poor People's Campaign is that it did not look at issues in isolation. So when Dr. King identified the initial evils, he said poverty, structural racism, and the war economy, because he knew all of those things were interconnected, right? We have now added to that two evils, which are environmental destruction and the distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism, because we know that Christian nationalism undergirds all of these things, right? It strengthens them. It gives them some sort of false, like, authenticity. So I want to just say a couple of things, and I'm going to try to do this in like bullet points because I know we've gone on for a long time, but I want to set a little bit of the stage for where we're at and then what this does, because I think you have to understand where we're already at and then how it impacts us. So Dr. King said in 1967, the prescription for the cure rests in the accurate diagnosis of the disease. So we have to know what's already going on, and then we have to know what this disease infection is heading our way with Project 2025. As I mentioned, poverty is the fourth leading cause of death. 800 people a day die in America from poverty, and this is the richest nation in the history of the world. Already mentioned, 43% of New Yorkers are poor or low wealth. How many people here have seen increases in your utilities? My Con Ed bill's like out of control for my tiny little apartment. The percentage of low-income households that are spent on utilities is 6 times greater than what the average household or more wealthy household pays. It's, that percentage. 3 times more of their income goes towards water. The federal minimum wage hasn't been raised in 15 years. How many people would stay in a job that gives you no increase in 15 years? The living wage in New York is $23 an hour for an individual who does not have children, and then it goes up incrementally. And yet, 25% of New Yorkers make less than $15 an hour. So I say that because then we have to look at then what this is moving in and doing. And Edgar brought some of those things to the forefront, all right? So eliminating Head Start, as he mentions, impacts 800,000 poor and low wealth families with young children. 800,000. This project, I can hardly even say it, says it will end what we call universal free school lunch, which means if you're in a school that has low-income kids, my kid went to a Title I school. I loved our public schools, and they were Title I, and so they didn't discriminate and say, okay, well, only the poor families get the free lunch. And so then there's like shame involved, and it's really arduous for schools to kind of try to make these distinctions. They just provided free lunch and free breakfast. And this removes that ability to do that. It revisits how the thrifty food plan is formulated, which is what is formulated to give out what we consider food stamps. And it imposes really onerous requirements on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, what we know as SNAP. And these things were already cut this year. We saw a decrease in SNAP benefits. But the Project 2025 would reduce SNAP benefits by 22%. So we're doing nothing to increase people's wealth. We're only attacking the resources that they already have. Does anyone have any idea of what the leading cause of bankruptcy is in the United States? You can just shout it out. Medical debt. So we already live in a country where medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy. And yet, Project 2025 imposes stricter eligibility requirements on Medicaid, including work requirements, asset tests to constrain the access to Medicaid. What a lot of folks don't realize, and I will say I did not know this until I became involved in this. There was an omnibus bill signed at the beginning of, went into effect January 1st, 2023, that cut 24 million people off of Medicaid. It was called an unwinding. We can discuss the details, but it basically cut people off Medicaid. Often people didn't know until they went to the doctor to seek assistance, and they found out they were no longer on the Medicaid rolls. And if you have ever done health insurance paperwork, Medicaid paperwork, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's so invasive and time-consuming and burdensome. And yet, we made it easier for people to get on Medicaid during the pandemic, and the country did fine. But one of the first things they did is, okay, nope, we're going to cut those people off. Almost 2 million people in New York have been cut from Medicaid. So, and I'll say one more thing. There are also, the Project 2025 looks for reducing or eliminating the supplemental security income and moving it to a block grant. And this most impacts seniors, people living with children, people with disabilities. So it just cuts it while raising all these other things. And it supports in this false Christian sort of like weirdly idealized way of looking at people's households. It suggests that, we could all just do childcare at home, right? So it supports home-based childcare, but not universal childcare. And yet it's increasing work requirements. So it's so contradictory. It's so intentionally cruel. And it hides itself in this 900-page document. Who wants to go home and read a 900-page document? I think it's intentionally long and wordy, because if you dig into it, you see what it's really doing. I'm sorry, does any of this seem pro-family, pro-life, pro-humanity, pro-dignity? It's hard to, as a Christian, it's already been said, it is hard to see how Christians are supporting this. We are already in an economic crisis in this country, and this will do nothing but make it worse. New York has the greatest wealth income disparity and the highest percentage of millionaires and billionaires. Those things will increase because taxes on the poor and the middle class are going to be raised, and taxes on the rich are going to go down. I don't know. I just don't find this in my Bible. I want to see where Jesus said these things. I think Caesar may have said a few of them. It's very Roman Empire-esque. It's very Pax Romana, but it's like, anyway, I'm going to leave it there and turn it to my colleague.
Yeah, so I think the segue coming from economics to climate is very appropriate, because the basis, the philosophical perspective of this Project 2025 is ostensibly America first, right? But it really is money first. the money interests first. And the war economy that you mentioned that Dr. King was concerned about, it's not only a war, an armaments race kind of war, but it's a war against the earth. It's the utilization of all our knowledge and mechanization and industrialization to extract value, to reduce the value of the world around us, and to monetize it, and to put that money in the pockets of a very few people and a very few moneyed interests. And this whole document of the 2025 project is focused on that, right? Because all of the cutting of programs is intended to be a pay for, for tax cuts for the wealthiest of Americans, right? So this America first, money first, war against nature should be posed over and against the global web of life. Because what they are attempting to do is to try to, build a wall around the moneyed interest of America, or global moneyed interests, over against the well-being of the entire globe. The entire globe. One of the saddest experiences I've had in some of these international meetings that I've attended, both at COP26, but since then in other places, most recently at the UN High-Level Week related to the General Assembly that just started, is to hear representatives of the Pacific Island nations that are disappearing into the water, where the seas are rising, and they are already moving people to the other side of the island, to the higher level of the geography that they do have, and making plans for what they're going to do when the water inundates the entire nation, their entire nation, their island nation. These tiny places don't have time for us to get our act together over the next, century or half a century or even decades. They are even now drowning. And we see what's happening along our own coasts with the rising sea levels in Florida in particular, and the Gulf Coast in particular, where, of course, some would say, one of the candidates is certainly saying, we don't have to worry about climate change. As the seas rise, it just creates more coastline, new coastline. Yes, the people that live behind the wealthy homes on the water's edge right now are now being priced out of housing, because those folks recognize that their own homes are being devastated by these storms and sinking into the sea as the coasts erode. So they're just backing up and buying out those other neighborhoods. So the poor then have to run again to a new place. So I just want to walk through a few points in the 2025 document that have been lifted up by different reputable sources of analysis. First, an analysis by the Sierra Club, where they succinctly say, simply put, Project 2025 would be game over for climate progress. And then they delineate some of the specific items. The gutting of the Environmental Protection Agency, clean air, clean water, forget about it. Drinking water, it'll all be privatized, right? So that it can be bottled up by Nestle and other conglomerates, and then sold back to us, in order for us to get water that's potable. Dismantling the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been legislatively the best thing for climate that has ever been enacted by this country. which has made funds available for subsidizing of movement to renewable energy across the country, the access to, by some, certainly not by others, but the access by some to, to electrified transportation sources. And there's debates on all these things, of course, and those of us who are further to the more progressive end of the spectrum, have things we criticize about that act, but it still is the best thing for renewable energy that this country has ever seen. And now 2025 would dismantle it. Handing public lands over to oil and gas companies whenever and wherever they want. Particularly, this is an onerous matter for indigenous communities out west, where their own sacred sites would be despoiled. Halting all government action to reach our climate goals that have been agreed on with the other nations of the world in very tedious negotiations, far too tedious, I would say. But we do have some goals, and this project would totally toss those out, pull us out of the climate agreements that we are already a part of. The purging of the federal government of anyone except for the far-right party loyalists, which would mean a complete anti-science kind of process that would cut across the whole of government. I have analysis from a number of other sources as well that I won't go through, but thankfully to Eileen, she has made some copies of my notes, and you can pick those up on the table here. Or if you ask her to, I'm sure she could forward to you the digital version, which also includes some links to some of these places where you can find out more information. But, as I said before, the table on which we all stand, the table that is shared by all our brothers and sisters across the globe, is being eroded right now. And we have to take common action together with others. And there's no space for this America first or money first a strategy and approach to life. We must take action to save our planet and to save our fellow man, brothers and sisters, and to save ourselves as well. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I want everybody to just thank them with an applause for their coming. We're going to discontinue the live stream now, and I just wanted to let you know that Fred's papers are here. My stapler didn't work, but they're every other place, so you can pick those up. I have a list here of additional concerns from Project 2025 that we did not cover today, where the president gets all kinds of power. There's a whole list here. There's a list on this green piece sheet of what we're doing next for our Voices for Justice, and a brochure about our church.